Castor webinar on responding to journal peer reviewers. I named it Really Respond to Peer Reviewers to highlight the importance of being responsive to reviewers to help you successfully move your papers forward toward publication. I want to start, I know we have about 11 participants, including me. Let's start by having everyone introduce themselves in the chat. If you could please type your name and your role or your affiliation with Castor, then we can kind of all see who's here and have a chance to say hi. Before we start, I want to say a big thank you to the Castor leadership, David Levy and Rafael Meza, and to the Career and David Mendez, and then also to the Career Enhancement Corps for providing an excellent structure and support for Castor trainees and for being so supportive of my efforts and offering training activities on writing and publishing. Thanks to Molly for helping organize the webinar and for moderating today. Thanks to Amanda Dudley for her outstanding administrative support. And a special thank you to Stephanie Land, Program Director and Statistician in the Tobacco Control Research Branch of the Behavioral Research Program Division of the Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the NCI. She was a journal editor for many years and offered some great tips that I have incorporated into today's presentation. Few quick housekeeping notes. We ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. It feels like everyone has their microphone muted right now, which is great. Type your questions into the chat at any time. You can address general questions to everyone. Molly's our Zoom host. She'll be monitoring the chat. If we run out of time for questions, which I don't think we'll run out of time today, we may end early, I'm happy to follow up afterward with responses to questions we couldn't get to. Also, we ask that you avoid using Otter AI or other recording devices or note-taking devices. We will circulate the slides afterward as well as the recording, so you will all have access to those things. So, deep down, academics want the same thing as everyone else, acceptance with minor revisions. This is a little early Valentine's Day academic humor for you. This message also highlights the main goal of this presentation, to help you respond to the peer reviewers in a way that leads to acceptance and publication. More specifically, the objectives are to appreciate how the peer review system works, to organize and format your response to reviewers to facilitate success, to recognize the value in being highly responsive and how to convey that responsiveness. Where warranted, learn strategies for ways to respectfully reject a reviewer's suggestion. And I also have some additional tips for navigating common challenges authors face in responding to peer reviewers. So I'm going to start by providing an overview of how the peer review system works. For many of you, I know this will be review, but I want to make sure that we all sort of start out on the same page and with the same sort of background context. All right, so the peer review system is designed as a gatekeeping system to help journals publish only the highest quality research. Importantly, in this context of our webinar, it's also designed to help us improve our manuscripts before they're published by leveraging, the input of experts in the field and on the topic area of your paper. One final thing before I show this graphic of the peer review system, I'm sure you know that the vast majority of peer reviewers perform this service for free. While this, in some ways, this kind of makes the system a little bit wonky in some ways, it's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we think about the peer review system, as we respond, kind of to help us recognize and express gratitude for the reviewers contributing their time to help you improve your paper. So here's kind of a schematic of the peer review system. You submit the paper, the editor receives it. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but one outcome could be rejection without review. This is sometimes called desk rejection, in which case you revise your paper and submit it to a different journal. In other cases, the editor will send the paper for review. You'll get peer reviewer comments. Sometimes at that point, you can receive a rejection, in which case the goal would be to revise and submit to a different journal. Sometimes the peer reviewer comments will come back with major revisions, in which case you will revise and resubmit to the same journal. And you can kind of go back and forth a bit with the reviewers, multiple rounds of review and comments. Hopefully that will lead to publication. In other cases, a peer reviewer comments will be minor in nature. And again, you'll revise and resubmit, go back and forth with the reviewers a couple times. Again, the ideal outcome will be leading to publication here. Rarely, although I do know people who have experienced this outcome of the peer review system, occasionally you will be accepted without any revisions whatsoever. That's amazing. I hope that happens to you. So just a few more words about the peer review process. Typically between 2 and 5 peer reviewers provide comments in their review, although I will say in the past few years, I've had a handful of papers reviewed by just one peer reviewer, and I think this is probably a reflection of a huge increase in the number of journals that are competing for a limited number of peer reviewers who are volunteering their time. Most often, reviewers are anonymous to you, the author. In other words, the authors don't know who the peer reviewers are. Sometimes a review is double anonymized, so that means that a reviewer also does not know the names of the authors. Upon submitting a paper, often you're asked to provide names of 3 potential reviewers. Though I will say recently, I've noticed that certain journals are no longer asking for reviewer names. I don't know if this is the beginning of a trend or just some journals find their own reviewers. Sometimes you're asked when you're submitting the paper to flag reviewers or even sometimes academic editors that you don't want to review your paper. So in thinking about these things that you're asked to provide during submission, it's a good idea to look at the author guidelines before you sit down to submit a paper so you can really be prepared with this information and other information you might be asked for. I'll also say for junior reviewers, it's a good idea to consult with the senior junior authors, I should say. It's a good idea to consult with the senior authors on, potential author reviewer names and flags if you're the one submitting the paper, so you can benefit from their perspectives and experience. And so you can be prepared as you sit down to submit the paper. Okay, we all learn to write in specific formats by studying examples. So in this presentation, I show a lot of examples. They're almost all from publicly available reviews. In the next few slides, I'm going to go over how you can access these types of examples because they really can be helpful as models for both writing a review as well as responding to reviews. So this screenshot is from BMJ Open. They have so-called open, publicly available peer reviews for their papers. The first thing to do to find a review example is go to their website and search for a paper on your topic. And then you can, find a good example paper that seems like it's on a similar topic as yours. Then select that paper by clicking on the article result that you're interested in. So that you're looking at the paper in this view. Then go to this little information icon here at the top, And you'll see this information here displayed, and then look down at the bottom and scroll down to the publication history. You can see there's links to the previous versions. So all of the previous versions of the paper will be available for you to look at. Also, all the peer reviews are also there. So once you click on a previous version of an article, you can see that. And then here is the peer reviews, including all the author responses. And this is definitely is not the only journal that publishes peer reviews. Other journals also publish open peer reviews, like the BMC journals are another example. So there's lots of examples for you to look at if you're interested. Okay. Now we're going to start the main part of the webinar about preparing responses to reviewers. But before we do, I want to ask for your thoughts. So I'm guessing that at least some of you have served as peer reviewers for journals in the past. So for those of you who have been peer reviewers, for journal peer reviewers, based on your experience, please share with the group what you suggest that authors can do in preparing their responses to reviewers to be successful in moving their paper forward toward publication. So do you have any suggestions or tips for authors? Type those ideas into the chat. Once we have critical mass, I'll ask Molly to jump in and summarize the responses. So I'm going to keep flipping through the slides a little bit. Sometimes it can take a few moments for those comments to come in. Actually, I'm going to pause because we have another activity coming up. So we'll just wait, and I'll let Molly jump in when she's ready.
Maybe back up one slide, Ella, while people are perfect.
Thank you.
Sure, we've got one response. Be responsive to the feedback when possible.
What's that? Can you repeat that?
Be responsive to the reviewer feedback when possible.
Yeah.
Even when you don't feel it's strictly necessary.
Great advice.
So this one's about formatting, clearly highlighting and tracking where the changes that were made in the manuscript. For example, using line numbers.
Really key to really identify and make it easy for the reviewers to let them know where the changes were made. Another piece of great advice. I'll say something about line numbers in a few slides, so keep that on ice. Maybe if one more comes through.
Nothing else yet.
Okay, well, let's keep this in our minds. And then, as maybe people will think of additional thoughts and put them into the chat as we move forward. And let's just go ahead and go to the next slide here. So this first topic I did want to talk about was already mentioned and highlighted by one of the participants, is making it easy for the reviewers to navigate your responses. So the overall goal, of course, in preparing your response to reviewers is to convince the reviewers that you've responded to their concerns and that the paper is worthy of publication. Formatting and organization are an important part of achieving this goal. I'm starting here because there's a lot of room for improvement in this area, and implementing a few key strategies can really help you be more effective. So later in the webinar, I will address presenting arguments and, that advocate for your paper and the changes that you made. But you can think of these first few sections as sort of low-hanging fruit that can be incorporated pretty easily and that translate into big gains. So I want to start by doing an activity. This is going to be a breakout activity. I think Molly emailed 3 examples of responses to peer reviewers to all the participants. And we're going to do a breakout room activity with them. So we're going to look at, you should have gotten 3 PDF files. If you haven't checked your email, go ahead and check your email. And we're going to look at review examples 1, 3, and 5. Those should be the only 3 files she sent. Open those up. And once you open them up, you're going to have to scroll down a little bit to where you see the words version 1 author response. Okay. And then just skim the format of each response to reviewers. It's not about reading the text. It's really just looking at how the authors organized their responses to reviewers. So just kind of glance down a few, couple paragraphs just to get a sense. Also, just side note, reviewer and author names typically do appear on these open peer reviews. I took out the author and reviewer names just from these examples, just myself, because the goal here is not to call anyone out. I just want the focus to be on the content of the examples. So sorry, I didn't click this last button. So this is the directions. Skim the format of each example's author response, the way they organized it, and think about which format, and talk about with your group, which format you think is the easiest to read and follow, and why. If everyone wouldn't mind putting their cameras on for a sec, I just wanted to ask, I realized I probably should have done this at the beginning. How many people have done a journal peer review, have actually been a peer reviewer for a journal? I guess you don't really need your camera. You can electronically raise your hand, but it's always nice to kind of see everybody for a second and just get a little better sense of who's here and your experience. How many people you can raise your actual hand or your electronic hand. How many people have done a journal peer review? Hannah? Okay. All right. So that really is very, very helpful. Thanks. Thanks for sharing that. Looking at the author responses, even if you haven't done a journal peer review, my hunch is that you probably had some thoughts on which way, what was more effective to organize the reviewer responses. You can see there's a lot of variety. I am going to share my screen with the PDFs as people talk, so we can kind of focus our attention on the documents. Let me see if I can see okay, now I can kind of see everybody too at the same time. So group 1.
Are you able to make it the PDF bigger, like fill your whole
bigger?
screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Like that?
Yeah, it's just it's not filling the whole screen. Like I'm seeing the goose on the
Oh, sorry.
on the left.
Little goose family. I just think they're so cute. Is that better? A little bit? Okay. All right. So I don't know if you remembered whether you were group 1 or group 2. I see Hannah as the first person on my little squares here. Hannah's group. What did you think about the different? Which do you think was the most effective and the least effective?
Yeah. So we talked about. Oh my gosh, sorry, I don't have the version up. I think, it was example 1. The one that had the responses in a table was the one that we had liked the best, because I think we thought it was just like, there's like sort of this discrete area where each response and then the response to the review that was really helpful. And then I think the one we liked the least was, I can't remember if it was 3 or 5, but there was one where the responses were completely separated from the reviews. And so if you wanted to read the response, you would have to scroll up and see what the critique was that they were responding to. So I think that was our least favorite. And then the one
3, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so just some basic navigational things made it either super easy to go back as a reviewer and remember what you wrote and see what the response is to your comment, or made it a lot of work. What about the other group?
We agreed that the first example with the table was the most easy to follow. And then there was some discussion that most of us had done the italicized answer underneath. I think it was example 5
Mm-hmm.
when we
You'd like that the second best or the third best?
second best, but that's the approach that we normally take instead of making a
I
table.
see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, great. All right. That's interesting to know. So it's maybe this is like a little bit new, looking at a table and something new to think about. Okay, great. Thanks. Any other comments on the examples before we move on? Okay, thanks so much for your participation. I'm going to see the geese again for a second while I get my... Okay, can you see my slides, Molly? Okay, great. All right. So I'm going to put this back. Okay. All right. So the next thing I'm going to do is, I felt like I missed a slide, but I guess not. I want to show a sample text with some potential ways that you can formatting things that you can use to respond to reviewers. So obviously you want to make it as easy as possible for the reviewers to follow your responses and changes. So here's some sample text you might use to begin your responses to reviewers. I recommend always starting with a word of thanks to show your appreciation. Again, thinking about the volunteers taking time out to give you advice to improve your paper. I would say next, be sure to tell the reviewer where each and every change was made. This might sound like a detail again, but so important. I've been the guest editor for a special collection this past year for Sage Publisher, and I've actually had reviewers refuse to review author responses that were sort of disorganized and complete. And maybe you have experienced this frustration. I guess Hannah's our person who's been a peer reviewer. We do occasionally end up returning these responses to the authors to reorganize them, which, really sets the authors back in reaching their goal of publication. Also, make sure your changes are clearly marked in your revision. Typically, you're asked to submit a marked up copy as well as a clean copy. Some authors like track changes. I think I heard someone mention them earlier. Others feel it's too messy. Some authors just like to mark the additions in red or with yellow highlight to keep the document manageable and a bit more streamlined. Both approaches are acceptable. Here's another example from the publicly available examples. You can see the authors are responding multiple times here. We considered your suggestion, and I'm sure none of you would respond to a reviewer like this, but I have seen these kinds of responses myself. It is really frustrating as a reviewer. Responses that don't clearly address a reviewer concern, they don't really go away. They just kind of add work for the reviewer and the author to address in the next round of revision, sort of ultimately delaying the whole process. So, it's also very possible, as I mentioned, that the reviewer will simply recommend rejection of a paper after getting a response like this. Just last week, I had a reviewer recommend rejection of a paper based on the way that the responses were organized. So it does happen. I'm sure this would never happen to you, but this is just an example to kind of reflect on and think about. This example is better than the previous one, I would say, but does fall a bit short since it doesn't give the location of the new text. You see it says additional results have been provided. But where are these new results? The reviewer is going to have to comb through and find where the authors made this change. I included an alternate response here, one that shows, gratitude for the suggestion and that identifies where the change was made in the third paragraph of the results. I know someone mentioned line numbers earlier. I tend to not include line numbers. I tend to go by paragraph numbers in my responses here. What I've learned over the years is that line numbers can be confusing. This is for a couple different reasons. Authors may be required to add line numbers to their document, but then often the submission system adds another set of line numbers that are different. And I have had the experience where, for some reason, all of the line numbers shift from those that the author sees to those that the reviewer sees, which is just so confusing. So a way to get around this potential confusion is just to give paragraph numbers, like the third paragraph of the results, or table numbers or figure numbers to help the reviewer locate where you made the change. It's a little bit challenging to read some of these examples out of context, but here, from a tobacco paper, the reviewer is saying, I think that a sentence is incomplete. And I think they're suggesting to add this phrase under different rates tax systems, tax rates or systems. The author's response is not very complete. And maybe if you would have read the whole paper, it would be more clear. But at the minimum, explaining it a bit more fully in a complete sentence will help the reviewers, understand the author's response. The authors also ideally would have indicated, whether they made a change in the text, and then where. And I'm sure the authors did not intend for this to come off as not taking the reviewer's concern seriously, but it could. So I've crafted an alternate way of considering responding in a complete sentence with the new text included, along with where the text was, the change was made. So thank you for flagging this unclear sentence. We've revised the text to clarify that we are referring to different types of tax. This revised sentence include whatever it is, it's hard for me to make something up based on this example, is now incorporated in the first line of the second paragraph in the introduction. So another point here, take-home point, is that it is super helpful to, if where you can, paste in the revised text right in the response. So the reviewer has their comment, your response, as well as the text, the new text that you've just added. Makes it super easy.
Ella, there's a question in the chat regarding line numbers.
Yeah.
So it says, if the reviewer suggests changes according to line numbers, is it okay to not use them in your response?
I would say yes. I would say just respond and give the paragraph, you could say the third line of the second paragraph or something. But I would avoid using line numbers. I've definitely been in situations where I was the author, and maybe some of you have been in this situation. The line numbers just didn't make any sense based on what the reviewers were telling me. So I've had to email the editor, and they've explained that, there's all these wonky things that can happen with line numbers. So I would say my advice would be just to steer away from line numbers. Yeah, where possible. Okay, sometimes, unfortunately, you just don't understand a reviewer comment. This actually happens more than you'd think. I reviewed maybe 25 or 30 examples for this when I was preparing for this talk. And I probably saw this 5 or 6 times where the authors didn't understand a comment. That seems like a lot. So, this is something we could keep in mind really as peer reviewers as well. But if you do get a comment you don't understand, I guess the first thing I would suggest is asking your co-authors to read the comment to see if they understand it. That's happened to me before where I didn't really kind of get what the reviewers were saying, but some of my co-authors were like, oh, I think this is what they're saying. But if nobody understands it, then be sure to respond. Never skip an item. Respond and just let the reviewer know, you didn't understand it. This is what the author did here. Rather than skipping it or guessing, the example here is a good one, I think. Just let the reviewer know you didn't understand their comment. It's really not much else you can do. Okay. So in bringing some of the advice together from the past few slides, I have a suggested format for responding to a comment that you agree with. So, and this is not prescriptive, but these are all components to think about and consider when you're preparing your response. So I'm not going to take time to read the entire example. You can always circle back later and look at the slides. I'm just going to focus on the recommended components here. So first, as we've discussed, repeat the reviewer comment so the reviewer doesn't have to go back and search for it. Next, consider either telling the reviewer that you agree with their suggestion, or you can just, say thank you. Be clear about the change you made, if you made a change. Again, as I mentioned before, it's nice to paste the new text in. If you crafted new text or if you revise text, just makes it easy for the reviewer to just see everything in one, block. And finally, as I've mentioned, include the location of the revision. Okay, now I want to move on to talking about ways you can be really responsive to peer reviewers. So your response really should be an argument that the revisions you made strengthened the paper. I mean, that's what everyone wants, right? That's what the reviewer wants. That's what the editor wants. That's what the authors want. Be explicit about this, as explicit as you can, that the revisions you made improve the paper. And that's going to feel good to the peer reviewers, like what they suggested helped you, but that's what they want. Sometimes you'll find an error in the process of revision that the reviewers missed. No need to point that out. Just go ahead and change that. And then, always keep your eye on the goal of moving your paper forward toward publication. I just want to say something about the editor here. Don't forget that in addition to the reviewers, the editor is also an important audience for your responses. Even though you are addressing your comments to the reviewers, the editor really actually wields more power than the reviewers because they have the final say in whether your paper gets published. So, whereas each reviewer, may be focused on how you responded to their individual comments, the editor in particular may appreciate arguments that the overall quality of the paper improved based on the collective revisions that you made. And, you can make these arguments broadly at the beginning of your response before you sort of get into the details of responding to each item. And, of course, you can make individual arguments as well. I just realized probably an example would have made this nice. I'll see if I can find an example to send along if people are interested. It's always good to have examples. Just making myself a note here. So let's see. The other thing to remember about the editor's review is that the editor didn't write the comments. So as an editor, sometimes you're in a position of trying to understand a reviewer comment or where a reviewer is coming from, in addition to assessing the author's response. So the editor is sort of tracking this conversation that they're not really directly a part of. So that's just another reason to be really comprehensive in your response and to include all the information needed to assess, whether you adequately address their concern. All right. So I think somebody mentioned this earlier. If you don't disagree with the suggestion, go ahead and make the change. That's my advice to you. It's a good idea to implement as many suggestions that you agree with, as well as the, those comments or suggestions that you don't necessarily find super helpful, but you don't really object to. For example, if a reviewer's suggestion doesn't seem like it would maybe improve the text very much, maybe that they just have a style preference. But if you don't object to it, go ahead and make that change to show that you're being responsive. And of course, you shouldn't make changes that you disagree with. And I'll say a little bit more about this point in a bit. So this is something that Stephanie Land from the NCI, who I acknowledged earlier, suggests that it's a suggestion from her. She suggests that we envision our reviewers as friendly colleagues, and this is good advice. This is an example from a paper I wrote with a colleague on the importance of emphasizing titles in assigned writing. So it's an article giving advice on how to teach writing. So this comment was actually kind of funny because the reviewers were asking us to modify the title of our paper about titles. It was kind of like meta. And I'm not going to read this whole thing here, but the reviewers, both of them, actually had this really super friendly tone throughout this review. And we did our best to reciprocate that in our response. And I will say that even if reviewers don't come across as super fun or friendly, imagining them as friendly colleagues, I think, can help you get into the mindset where you see them as wanting to help you. And this can help you respond in a way that makes them feel like you value their comments. In some cases, you can even build sort of a rapport with the reviewers this way. All right. So this next piece of advice is helpful for writing a response to reviewers, but it's also something I cover in my training on how to write a paper. Every study has limitations, and you need to be clear about yours in your discussion. But there's an approach that can help you kind of soften how some of your limitations land with your readers in the paper, and that can also be helpful in your responses to reviewers. This approach is to acknowledge your potential limitations, and then defend them where appropriate. So let's just look at this first one here. This is an example from a published paper where they did a nice job of this. They acknowledged their potential limitation, and then they defended it. So to sort of defend or minimize the limitation. So here the limitation is that not all immunizations were captured in their study. But the authors kind of go on to explain that this limitation's not a major issue for their study, and they explain why, which I have not included all the details on their response. But this can be a really helpful, move for reviewer responses as well. It's not a good approach for every limitation. Sometimes you have a limitation that did negatively impact your study. And in that case, it's really important to acknowledge it and then also to be specific on how it impacted your results. Did it artificially overestimate your point estimates, for example, or, some kind of insight, because that's what the discussion really is all about, right? Providing a context through which to understand and interpret your results. Okay, let's move on. Sometimes the reviewers ask a question or they ask for information, but they don't explicitly ask you to make a revision in your paper. So it can be a judgment call whether to change the paper or not. I will say that, and this is something I'm guessing you all know as well, that most of the time if reviewers are asking for information, they want it to be added to the paper. And then in this example, the reviewers are asking for the percentage of missing data. They're expressing a concern about, the bias the missing data may cause. So the authors do a good job here of responding to the reviewer's comment and really being clear that they added information in their paper and then pasting that sentence that what their new text how their new text reads, so the authors can see, well, they responded and here's what they said. Okay, so the next topic I want to talk about is disagreeing tactfully with the reviewers. So the first point is that when something is important to your author team and the integrity of your paper, you should defend it. Disagreeing with reviewers is completely acceptable. And although, this should constitute a very small proportion of your responses, it's definitely acceptable to disagree with the reviewers. It's all about how you do that. So the examples I'm about to show are from a paper I published a while back. I had 2 reviewers. Honestly, neither were terribly helpful reviews. Both made a bunch of, what I consider the sort of style suggestions, and I implemented the vast majority, almost all of these suggestions, even though I was kind of equivocal about whether most of them improved our paper. But there was a few suggestions that I really just disagreed with, and this was one of them. You can see in this first excerpt, the reviewer wants us to remove the contraction "its" and use "it is" instead. And probably to many of you, this probably seems like a small issue, and most people would probably not have cared. But I'm a writing person, and I had reasons for wanting to retain the contraction, so I crafted a response that gave reasons why we can retain the contraction. And so the reviewer came back in the next round to say the contraction error still needed to be corrected. Note that they didn't provide a reason or justification. So while this is a webinar on responding to peer reviewers, it's also important to remember that as a peer reviewer, you also need to justify your suggestions. And this is really part of the scientific process. So in our second reply, we recapped our reasons. We also reviewed the author guidelines to make sure there wasn't, some kind of style guide that prohibited the use of contractions. And then we shared that with the reviewer. The reviewer author guidelines didn't prohibit the use of contractions, but we also used what could be a really good strategy when you're sort of at a standoff a little bit with the reviewer. We said we would defer to the editor if she wanted us to take out the contraction. So we stood our ground, but we made it clear it wasn't, a hill we were willing to die on either. So in a situation like this, when you're at sort of an impasse, saying you'll defer to the editor can be a really helpful strategy because it shows flexibility and a willingness to work with the people who are really going to make or break you in terms of the publication. Ultimately, you're going to work with a journal to move the paper forward. And turns out the editor was totally fine with the contraction. She wrote a nice note in our acceptance email thanking us for being so clear and so responsive to the reviewers. So from her standpoint, she was completely satisfied. All right, let's take another look at another example here. So what I want you to do here is I want you to take a few seconds to read the example and then take a few seconds to think about it, and then I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you want to share your thoughts about the author's response what do you think of it? And if you were to respond differently, what would you do differently? Thoughts? Anyone want to take a stab sharing their perspectives on this response?
I'll go.
Yes. Yeah, great.
I think it's an acceptable response because you cited previous use in the literature. The only thing I would say is the last question to improve the comparability of findings that wasn't really addressed in that, I would say. But that's just my opinion.
Good. Right. Okay. Yeah, good point. So there was a question that wasn't addressed, although the authors did respond to the first question. Other thoughts on this response?
I can jump in.
Yeah, thanks.
If nobody else. Yeah. I also, so, I mean, the reviewer asked, why did you not consider other approaches? So there's sort of an assumption there that they didn't. So I would answer that question as well. And then the other piece is, in the response, the author says any method used to value a life year has advantages and disadvantages. We include citations to justify this. I would just give like a brief explanation here to make it easier for the reviewer and the editor to understand your rationale.
Right. Exactly. I totally agree with that. I think this could have been responded to a bit more fully, and then no specific reason is given. It just says it's an acceptable approach as summarized in the literature, and maybe they did go into detail in the paper. But again, this is where it would be really helpful for them to A, be specific, and B, include what they it says they included citations, so it's not clear they even added any additional text. But I think more detail might be to really feel like you're responding to the peer reviewers would have been helpful in that example. Any final thoughts on this one? Okay. All right. Let's do another one of these here. Take a look at this example and ask for someone to share their impression of the response and whether the author could have done something differently, or they think this is effective.
I could go. I think that it would have been nice if the author perhaps mentioned this as a limitation in their study, as being like, yes, we acknowledge that we didn't have sufficient sample size to address this, and maybe mentioning that to the reviewer, being like, we have added this as a limitation now. Thank you for pointing that out.
Great point. Great point. Yeah. So they are responding to the, directly to this point that the reviewer's making, but they could have taken it one step further and saying, yeah, this is a limitation, and we've added this to the discussion, and sort of acted on your comment to implement that into the paper. Great point. Others on this one? All right. So here's some sort of bulleted pieces of advice for disagreeing with the reviewer. As I mentioned, it's fine to respectfully disagree with a comment. Sometimes, a lot of times, reviewers miss something. They're not super familiar with their paper, but maybe if they miss something, readers will also miss it. So it could be that, you need to clarify something, but, maybe they miss something really important or obvious. Sometimes peer reviewers, and maybe some of you have had this experience as authors, where peer reviewers offer conflicting advice and you need to decide which is best. Or maybe sometimes you just simply disagree with the advice. Provide carefully crafted arguments and explain specifically why you disagree. And then provide evidence to support your point of view or, your perspective where applicable. Reviewers should really get the impression that you took their comments seriously and you did your best to improve the paper. So, here's a suggested format you can think about for when you disagree with the reviewer comment. So, first, I would say start by identifying an area of agreement to show common ground between you and the reviewer. That's like a great way to start. So in this example, the authors agree that socioeconomic status is an important confounder to take into consideration when studying tobacco use. So your response should be, I think these animations are a little bit out of order. So your response should make it clear that you did not suggest implementation. And it's crucial to justify, why you did not implement the reviewer's suggestion. Yeah, here we go. In this example, the authors gave two reasons. First, their paper was not aimed at investigating the association in detail. And second, the suggested analysis is beyond the scope of the paper. So references are not included in this example. Maybe, I don't know, references necessarily make sense in this example, but often including references can be very helpful, like in the paper, but also in your response to the reviewers, or just to add strength to your argument. Finally, your response should give the impression you really considered the comment seriously and you didn't just kind of blow it off. One phrase you can use to convey this impression is after considering your suggestion or after reflecting on your suggestion or after discussing it with a colleague or co-authors. Something like that can really help to let reviewers know you took it seriously. Okay. Now I'm going to go through a few common challenges that authors experience as they prepare the response to reviewers. So in some cases, you might get the same comment or this very similar comments from 2 or 3 of your reviewers. This consistency is a sign that your readers are all responding in the same way to your work, and it's a sign the advice is probably very good. But sometimes you get contradictory comments from different reviewers. And in some cases, it will be really obvious to you which comment you should act on and which you disagree with. But in other cases, it will not be obvious. If you're unsure, one thing you can do is sort of pull back and consider how different types of readers are responding to your work. So one thing that can be helpful to do is sort of think about each comment in the context of who it came from and how they align with the core readership of the journal. So for example, if a statistical reviewer is giving advice that contradicts a so-called content reviewer, ask yourself who is more similar to the actual readership of the journal. Okay, so that could be, one guide to help you identify how much, weight to give a comment. In other cases, maybe the identity of each reviewer is not that different or not that important or obvious even. But regardless, your job sort of as a writer is to decide which advice works best for the paper. One approach to avoid is telling a reviewer that you're not implementing their suggestion because the other reviewer told you to do it a different way. Give a reason and justify it based on science. And then once you decide on your response, then respectfully convey it with a justification. One issue that can come up during revision is word counts. So I would say most of the time there's flexibility. in word count for revisions, because the majority of time reviewers, when they're giving comments, they're asking you to add information. And if the other editor doesn't say anything, there's nothing in the author guidelines, I just don't even worry about word limits. I just focus on responding to the concerns of the reviewers as well as I can. But sometimes a journal, and this happened to us just a few months ago, asks you to they're like really strict on word limits for revisions. I think this happened to a paper we had already submitted it, and we were kind of like a couple hundred words over when we submitted, and then the reviewers asked us to add all these kinds of things. And anyway, so in this example, this isn't the one from a few months ago. This is a different one, but we shared with the reviewers that we were really constrained. This is another example where they were really strict on revision word limits. So, we didn't want to appear like we weren't being responsive, like we wanted to let because the reviewers might not know that there's these strict word limits. So just letting them know can be helpful, just to give them a little context on why you might not have added all the information they asked for, etc. But I will say that word limits are often negotiable, so keep that in mind as well. So in this, yeah, that's right. In this example, yeah, we did a little negotiation as well. All right, final tips. This is about being in touch with your co-authors, these tips. Everyone should have, at the very minimum, all your co-authors should have a chance to read and agree. They should all agree with your responses and the revisions before it goes back to the journal. There's a lot of different ways of collaborating on your revision. Someone needs to be the leader to get the document organized, ask for input, integrate the author feedback, tie up loose ends. This could be the corresponding author, often it is, or maybe it's the first author. The take-home point is that be sure your team has a strategy and that everyone's clear on the process and the deadline. One final tip is to see if you can find, sometimes the journal has the peer reviewer guidelines on their website. So this can help you understand how the reviewers have been asked to evaluate you and what the journal prioritizes. You can also review the author guidelines to see if they, sometimes they include information about how your paper will be reviewed, but ideally you have looked at these early in the process, but better late than never. All right, so it's a kind of recap some of the points that we've covered. Appreciate how the peer review system is organized and learn how a journal guides review by reading the journal guidelines. Show gratitude for the time and expertise reviewers are volunteering. Make it easy for the reviewers by including all the information. Make sure your response is organized and easy to follow. Really respond to reviewers. Let them know you took their comments seriously. Argue that your revision strengthened the paper and that your revision is a high-quality manuscript. Disagree with suggestions that will not improve your paper, that you disagree with strongly. And then communicate with your co-authors throughout the process of revision. Make sure everyone has a chance to weigh in before you submit.